discuss rendering. We're going to look at two different types of rendering, an exterior and an interior, and talk about all of the settings that go into making a really good photorealistic rendering. Following the presentation, we're going to open up the chat panel so you can type in questions that you might have about rendering, and I'll be able to answer those live for you during the broadcast. Following the entire presentation, I'll send you out an email, and it will be a little booklet that'll cover all of the different terms that we covered today and examples so that you can read about everything that we talked about today. Also in that email, you'll find a link, and that will take you to our archive where you'll be able to watch past presentations. It takes about 24 hours to get a video uploaded to YouTube and formatted, so it should be there sometime tomorrow, this rendering class for you to review. But there is an older rendering class up there so that you can review it tonight if you wanted to as well. So let's get started talking about rendering, how to make the images on your screen really pop and look photorealistic when you send out JPEGs and bitmaps to your clients. When we're walking around and navigating through a scene, it always has that cartoony look, so it's quick navigation. But when we send it out, we want it to look spectacular. So we're going to talk about today different settings to make it look great. And there's three different things that go into making a really good rendering. One is the lighting in the space, two are the materials that you've used, and three are the settings that you're choosing when you're going to create the rendering. So for our exterior shot today, we're going to start looking at the material choices that you're making. One of the material choices that you make and has a big impact on the overall image of exterior views is the background image that you're using. I've chosen this one today, and it was one of our samples because it's kind of got a poor quality to it. The trees kind of look washed out, and that plays up in the rendering. When you create that photorealistic rendering, it's going to look like something has been dropped into the background. So if you come up to the settings pull-down menu and go to program settings, that's where you'll be able to swap out that background and get a nice high resolution background. The higher the resolution, the better it's going to look in your overall rendering. So on the left-hand side here, I'm choosing background. And I'm going to left click on the different scenes that are available there. It'll take me into a list of the different ones. I'm going to scroll up to the top, and I'm going to pick sky number 2 here. Sky number 2, I prefer to use this one because it's nice and light, and it doesn't overstep my rendering of the house itself. It's just a background. So it's not competing with the overall house in the image. It's nice and light, and it's a high resolution image. So I prefer to use that one. Another thing you should look at is the grass. The grass itself, when you go to render, if you find that it's really bright and it looks more like painted on green, then we should adjust the texture intensity of that grass. So again, I'm going to bring you back up to the settings pull-down menu and go back to program settings. Back in the program settings dialog box on the left-hand side, now we're going to look at terrain. And over here to the right, you can see the material that we've chosen for the terrain, this grass one. And I'm going to left click on that swatch to bring up that material. So that'll bring up the material dialog box, and I'm going to go down to our landscape materials in the list here. And I'm going to find grass number 1. I'm going to right click on grass number 1 and edit that material. For this material, the only thing I really want to look at so far is this one right here, texture intensity. So if you're finding that it's too bright, it's too intense, you might want to tone down that texture. So for our grass, I recommend having about 0.25. So I'm going to adjust that texture intensity for us. That's all I want to do for the grass. I'm going to click OK. And OK. And once again, OK. So the background itself is a material, the grass itself is a material, and you should adjust them to make sure that the background is a high resolution image. I try to take one that's not as busy as the others, so it really puts the emphasis on the house. And to look at the texture that you're using for the grass and make sure that the texture intensity, if you go to render it and you find that, whoa, it's overwhelming in the grass, tone down that texture intensity, bring down that value. And I put ours down to 0.25 today. Next, we're going to take a look at the other materials that are in the scene, like the stucco that's on this wall, and the door finish, and the roof finish materials as well. So I'm going to click on this materials paintbrush applicator here, and that will bring me into the materials catalog here on the right-hand side. Using this little feature here, the materials eyedropper, I'm going to left-click on it. It allows me to take a sample of the materials that I'm using. So I'm going to take a sample and find that I'm using stucco number 6. It'll draw me right to that in my materials catalog. I'm going to right-click and choose Edit Material so we can take a really good look at that stucco and the settings that are behind it. Down at the very bottom of the screen, you see Rendering Effects, and that's where we took the texture intensity for our grass and adjusted it. Next, we're going to display the settings in detail for this stucco. And there are 3 different settings for every material that you have in the catalog: specular, emissive, and transparency. The specular value, the greater the percentage, the glossier the finish is going to be, the more reflective it's going to be. Now, what I find in renderings that are sent into CADsoft and people are looking for some hints to make them a little bit better is sometimes they have their specular way up here at 63%. They want it to look really glossy, really reflective, so it looks clean and new. If you have everything so specular, so glossy, and so reflective, it really overpowers the image itself. So I would recommend having nothing over 15%. So if you were going to make this stucco a glossy finish, 15% would be the maximum that I would ever set for that. But our stucco today is going to be a dull finish, so I bring it right down to 0. If you do have something in your image that you really want to be nice and glossy and has that 15%, I would only make one material 15% glossy. Because again, if everything is glossy, it looks fake. It doesn't look as real and natural as it should. And you really want to draw emphasis in your eye attention towards one focal point in a rendering. So that should be the one glossy finish that you have. So really look at your imagery and look at the room you're in or the exterior view, and I would only give one specular up to 15%. Everything else can be less than that and make everything glossy that needs to be, but only one should be 15%. The next is emissive. Emissive means, does it glow light from it? And I use this strategically for our interior shots, which we're going to cover next. And I apply that to any light shades that I have. I might even turn off the light involved and just make the light shade emissive so it looks like it's glowing light. So anything that you want to glow, like a light shade or a fireplace image, then you can add that emissive value to it so it looks like it's glowing. We want our stucco to be 0. We don't want it to look like it's on fire. Next, we have transparency, and obviously for any glass elements, you want that to be 100%. For our stucco, I want that to be 0. But if I had glass block or something that I wanted to slightly look through, maybe some stained glass, I might bring that up to 50%. These values that you set in here really do have a dramatic effect on your overall rendering. So if you're finding that something looks a little too glossy or it isn't bright enough, it doesn't look like that lampshade is glowing, or the windows don't look transparent, this is where you can affect and really play with those materials so they have the effects that you want them to. Okay, so our stucco, I'm going to leave it at 0% for everything and click OK. Other finishes like that door, as an example, I might get that more of a glossy finish. So I'm going to, again, grab my eyedropper, click on that door. It'll take me to my decorative door materials, and I'll edit it. And looking at its custom preset values here, we can see that the picture of the door itself does have a kind of a glossy tone to it because it is an actual photograph of a door. But I might give it just a slight specular value there, maybe about 4%, so it does have some further sheen to it and reflective quality of any sunlight that might hit that doorway. So we're giving it a slightly specular view. Once we have the materials adjusted, then we can talk about lighting in the scene. So I'm going to come up to our landscape tab at the very top, And under the Landscape tab, I'm going to click on the Exterior Lighting on Location tool. I'm going to add some exterior lights to our view as well. And I'm going to go over and grab wall lighting. And we have a number of different wall lights to choose from. And I'll just grab one here out of our catalog, perhaps that one right there. And you can see as I bring it into the space, it already is illuminating. I'll just put it right there on that side wall right there. And I'm going to double click on that light. When you add lights into a space, and it's going to render the view, it takes a look at all of the lights that are in the space and comes to this lighting tab here. It looks at the wattage of that light, where the light is actually sitting. You can see that this light is going up. So the red dot is where the light starts. And you can see that it comes down from that fixture. That's the direction of the light. It's coming down. And then when it looks at that light, it then looks at all the materials around it. So this light being up against that wall, it would then look at that stucco finish and think, oh, do I have to be reflective? Am I reflecting this light out? No, it's 0% emissive and 0% specular, so that it's going to just absorb all of this light into it. But if it was a reflective surface, it would start reflecting out the light and bouncing it off of that surface. So lighting does have a dramatic effect on your renderings as well. If you're finding that the light is too bright, you can edit the light itself and change the wattage associated to it and bring it down. So right now we have a 75 watt. We could change that to maybe a 40 watt bulb and change that. Now you can see the ground flood up and see how the different circle there. That's the circle of light that you're going to get from the ground flood up. If I edit that back up and take it to our 75 watt or one of these different ones and click OK, you can see the different lights and where they're sitting. If I wanted this light to actually drop below and not come up above and then come down the light itself, this is where that value is being affected, right here, this Z value. So if I take that and make it -6, see how it's below the light fixture now? You can use that strategically, and I'll talk about this more when we look at an interior view. If you find the light is too close to a ceiling and it's creating burn marks up at the ceiling, drop it. Bring it down lower so it's not so close to the ceiling, and then the light can illuminate from a lower point. So you can use that strategically as well. Another thing with lights that you should look at is that emissive value on the materials that you're using. So if I go to the appearance page of this light, I have the light shade, which is stainless steel that they're using. But if it was another material, perhaps other than stainless steel, if we had created that out of some kind of glass, or let's come up to our glasses here. If I had like a crystal handle on that material as instead and edited that material, I could give it a slightly emissive value, so it looks like that fixture is emitting light even though we've dropped the light below. And I'm going to click OK and OK, and now we've changed the material on that light, and it's actually going to emit the light from underneath it. One thing to be careful of as well, I would never leave this custom value here at the 0 right inside the actual lighting unit, because the light would glow inside it and it wouldn't be able to emit outside of it. So always have it sitting above or below the actual unit itself so that it can have the chance and the opportunity to emit the light from it. Okay, so we've talked about lighting, the different types of light that you can have, how the light is being emitted down. I've put it beneath the fixture. We've talked about giving the shade itself, the cover, the ability to emit light so it looks like it's glowing and that it's turned on. And with the light itself, you could also turn it off. So if you found that in a room you have maybe 6 lights and you wanted to show all the lights in the room so they could see all the different fixtures, but it's way too bright and way too overwhelming with all of them on at once, you can actually turn off the light here so that you can see the fixture, but it's not going to emit any light from it at all. Okay, I'll click there. The other light that we deal with in the space is the actual sunlight. I'm going to go back up to the Settings pull-down menu, and I'm going to go to Program Settings. Under Program Settings, I'm going to go to Global Settings. This is where you can tell it where you are in the world, when it is, what time and year it is. So I'm going to say that it's actually 2015. We're sitting in June on the 16th. It will know that date. I can use the current time for rendering, so being 2:15 in the afternoon, and where north is located in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and it will know how to emit the light from the sunlight from that location. So I can use that strategically to show where the sun's going to be at that time of day in my rendering when I'm showing it to a client. Okay, so I'll hit apply and OK there. So the sun's now positioned in my scene. So I have my materials dealt with. I have the ones that are glossy, the ones that are not. I've looked at my grass, my background. I've looked at the lights in the scene. Next, I want to play with the settings that are going to affect the overall rendering. So I'm going to go up to the View pull-down menu. And underneath the View pull-down menu, you'll see Render 3D Real View. I'm going to pick on that. That takes us into a dialog box, which shows us our exterior. And in here, we have the navigational tools that we had outside of the rendering. So if I want to adjust it and look either way and change where I'm sitting, I can certainly do so and change that rendering. But what I want to deal with specifically here in this dialog box is down in the lower right-hand corner, you see Options. And I'm going to click on Options. This takes us into our settings that we can adjust to create our renderings. The first thing you might want to do is a system check. The software will go and check to make sure that you have the latest video card for your video card that you have in there. You have the latest driver, so it's going to run efficiently for you, and make sure that it can handle doing a rendering. And next you look at the levels of rendering. We have 5 different levels of rendering. So you'll see level 1 is the lowest, and it's the fastest. Level 5 is the highest, but it's also the slowest. It's going to take its time to create a really good rendering. Here at CADSoft, when we're creating the photorealistic renderings that you see up in our gallery on our website, we always do a mock-up first at a low level, maybe level 2 or level 3. We do a check just at those lower levels just to make sure there's not something that's going to create a nasty little shadow on our rendering. So here I am on an exterior. If I had a tree sitting behind me and it's going to cast a shadow, you might have a really ugly shadow on the front of my building that I hadn't expected. So if I had went to highest level 5 to begin with, I would have wasted my time. It's going to take a lot longer to produce a level 5 rendering. It's going to be slower. So always do your test runs at a medium or a low level to make sure that everything looks great, and then go to level 5 and let it create that nice high-level rendering. So choosing level 5 will produce the nicest rendering. It's going to have more rays of light into the scene. They're going to bounce off more surfaces, and by doing so create an even more photorealistic image where our lower levels don't produce as much light and rays of light, so they're not getting as photorealistic as our higher level. But obviously when you bounce off more lights off of all the different sources, it's going to take extra time to bounce them off every single surface that you see in a scene. Underneath the level, the ray tracing level there, you see anti-aliasing, which is quite honestly an ugly computer term. When we look at our renderings, and I'm just going to slide this out off to one side for a minute, what you might notice along the edges is sometimes they look a little jagged. Every video card is going to have a degree of difficulty creating a straight line in a 3D view. It gives a kind of a jagged appearance, especially determined on your camera angle. So if your camera angle isn't straight on, you'll see even more jaggeds the more off on an odd angle it may be. Because again, it's difficult for your computer to reproduce that image at that angle. What anti-aliasing does is it works with your video card to straighten out those lines so you don't see that jagged appearance. So I always make sure that that's set up to level 5. Again, when I'm doing a test run, I leave that at level 1. it's going to take longer to produce a rendering and straighten out those edges. So when I'm doing a test run, I leave it at 1. I know they're going to be jagged, but I know when I do produce my final one, I'll pump that right up to 5. Beneath that, we're dealing with the environment. Do I want to enable electric lights? So any lights that I have on the exterior, like that little sample light that I put up against the wall, do I want to turn that on or do I want to just keep it off? If I keep it on, it has this option here, ignore IES lighting settings, which is faster. Every light that we have in our catalog has IES settings behind them. Those are settings that are produced by the lighting manufacturers, like GE as an example. They're going to tell you exactly how that light bulb, or that intensity of a bulb, is going to actually light up a space. Because we have to read that file, and there's quite a bit of settings involved in it, it takes quite a bit longer time to use the actual lighting settings. So we have mock settings for each one of those that are faster to produce. So I always just ignore the IES settings. It's faster, and the other settings that we've put in there look just as realistic. Beneath that, do I want to enable the daylight? Or I could turn it off and there'd be no daylight, and I would be just, for the lighting in the space, I am going to only be using the actual physical electric lights that I put into the scene. And I wouldn't have any daylight whatsoever, so it would be a darker scene that I would be producing. I'm going to enable the daylight for hours. When the light is coming down from the sunlight, it can go through a partly cloudy or an overcast sky to kind of bring off the rays of light as well. Or you can say it's an absolute clear sky, and those beams of light from that sun are going to come straight down to hit your image. So either one. You'll notice if you produce each one, it doesn't really make a big, huge difference. Partly cloudy to a true sky, but you can try either one. Noise reduction. When we have both electric lights and we have sunlight coming together, those two lights are going to filter in together. So think about fingering those two lights together. When you do that, it can kind of give it a kind of a dusty, kind of a granular effect where the lights are meeting each other. So we call that noise reduction, to reduce those particles when those two lights come together. So I bound that up, and I'm going to bring that up to about 25, 26. So it reduces that specular look that you might have. So if you've ever created a rendering and had all of those kind of like pixelated looks, that's where the two rays of light are meeting, and we can reduce that noise by pumping up that value there. Tree and billboard intensity. So if you have any trees, which I do, and I have created some in the space, and the billboards are little shrubs and flowers in the flower garden. Again, just like our grass intensity, do you want those to be very intense, and do you want to tone them down? The setting that we have as a default is 70%, and that's a setting that we're happy with. It makes the trees and everything look realistic when you have them about 70%. The last settings that you have are for the background. So looking at that blue sky that I pasted in there. There's two different ways that you can show that background. One, you can use the background image and have it be a static background. So what the software actually does is it takes away the background, does the rendering, and then drops back in that JPEG as the background image. So it's not affected by any sunlight or any of the rendering effects that you put in. The other option that we have is a dynamic scaled background, so that it's going to remain in the scene when you're doing the rendering, and it's going to be affected by the sunlight and everything that you put into the space. When I'm using exterior renderings, I always use a scaled dynamic background. If you don't, what you might notice in your final renderings is that you kind of get a jagged edge, and a white jagged edge around all of your images. So I'm just drawing kind of a jagged edge around my trees and my tops of my buildings. You might get that view if you use a static background on exteriors. I always keep the image of the background in the view for exteriors, so it's scaled with it and it looks nicer and crisp. If you're finding that it's too bright and too intense, then you can scale it down. So when you do your test renderings, you can scale that image down if you find that it's too intense. But I use it at 100% and a dynamic background every time I do an exterior kind of rendering. Okay, so these are all of the settings that I would recommend when you're doing an exterior rendering. One, make sure that you check the color of your grass and make sure that that texture intensity, I usually set it about 0.25. Two, look at your background. Make sure that it's a high resolution background and that it's, in my opinion, less busy, so it allows you to focus on the actual house itself. Then look at the materials in the scene. Each material you should be looking at their specular, their emissive, and their transparent values to make sure that they match the actual material as it would be. So as far as our stucco, it was a 0% in all of them. As far as our window glass, it would be 100% transparent. You could give it a little specular value of about 5%, and I wouldn't make it emissive at all unless you wanted to kind of glow light in an evening rendering scene. So these are our values for our exterior rendering, and I'm just going to cancel out of here, close it up, and then I'm going to switch my window and go to an interior scene here. So I'm going to go to another model that I've got opened up, and we'll take a look at it. Again, same type of things that you should be looking at when you're in an interior scene. What are the materials you're using? What are the lights that are in the space, and how are you going to use them? So again, I've got some interior fixtures here. I want to take a quick check on their lights. You can see I've shut this one down. It's closed eye. If I turn it back on again, you can see that it brightened up the ceiling space. If I find that in the rendering it's way too bright in the scene, there's 3 lights here and there's another little pot light over the window. If it's way too intense, I would turn those right down. So with this one right here, it's exactly what we did, turned off the light. It was too bright right at the front of the rendering. Under the Appearance tab, however, I would go to the actual light itself, that dark gray reflector, and I would give that a emissive value so that kind of had a little bit of a glow to it. So I'm going to look at our colors because I think that was just dark gray. And I could edit that material, and looking at that material, I could give it a slightly emissive value so it looks like it's glowing in our scene. So I'm going to click OK there, and that light fixture, when we render it, would look like it's glowing. So I've turned off the light because there's too many lights on, and then I'm looking at the scene and wondering which one should be the most specular, the glossy finish. If I really wanted to focus in on the countertops, I could do that, or on the flooring as an example. So I'm going to, again, grab our material, paintbrush, grab our eyedropper and take a sample of that countertop material. And we've got a granite material, and I want to give it a nice specular finish. So see how we've got it up to 15%? So that's the focus on this rendering, the countertops. It's going to be glossy, it's going to reflect the light, and having these lights right over top of that countertop, it's going to have some really good reflections coming off of it. It's going to bounce off of this background, and if that's an emissive value too, it'll send that off. So we could get some nice specular imagery coming off of that countertop material at that 15%. But again, that means that any other materials that I have, I wouldn't want to be that glossy. Also looking at the space at hand, we've got some sunlight that we can be dealing with as well. We could have sunlight filtering through the windows. We have the actual light in here. So that means when I'm looking at that noise reduction that I'm going to want to reduce the noise as well. Another thing that helps produce an efficient rendering, if you have a very large project that you're working on, lots of walls, lots of windows, lots of doors, lots of stories, to the actual project. The one thing that I do, and I'm just going to turn this down into 2D, you can see I've gutted the model. It was much larger at one point, but now that I'm creating that rendering, and if I'm in a hurry, I get everything out of the scene. Because when it's looking at a model and it goes to render it, it's looking at everything in that model. Because something could be behind the camera and producing a shadow into the scene. So it has to consider it. So if you have a very large, elaborate model, lots of furniture into it, you're looking at maybe a 15 meg file, you might want to make a copy of it and gut it, get rid of everything but what you're going to actually physically see in the scene. And you'll find that that will help you to reduce the time that it's going to take to produce that rendering. If it's a huge model, then that model itself is going to take a longer time to look at all the materials in the scene and all the different objects. So I always gut it. And I did that exact same thing if we go back to our exterior view. Here we've got our house, but if I put it down into 2D, you can see there's nothing to it. Everything eliminated, gone. So it's a quick and easy render for it. Okay, so I'm going to go back to our interior. So in our interior, we've got the different materials. We've looked at the specular value of our countertop. We know about the lighting. Now let's take a look at the rendering settings that we're going to set here. So again, back up to my View pull-down menu, and I'm going to choose Render 3D Real View. Here in the 3D Real View dialog box, we get a preview of what it's going to produce for us. And I'm going to go to Options again. Here in Options, today I'm going to actually produce a rendering for us so we can see it produce, and I'll let it produce as I answer your questions for you. So I'm going to keep it on a moderate level that might even be a little bit high because we have a lot of you viewing today's class. We're going to slow it down over using GoToMeeting, but we'll give it a try. We're going to enable the electric lights, so all of those lights in the scene are going to filter down their lighting, but I'm going to ignore their IES settings so it's a lot faster to produce. We'll have the daylight on, and I will use noise reduction at a lower value. I put that about 15 so we can see the speculation that happens when those two different lights meet. When I'm in an interior, I don't bother to use the scale dynamic background. I use just a static background. So again, the static background means that it's going to rip off the background that I'm using, create the rendering, and then it's going to paste it right back in again for me as an image. So it's quicker to produce it, the rendering, and because it's just a shot outside the windows, you won't really see the difference anyway. So those are the settings that I'm going to use. I'm going to bring down anti-aliasing just a little bit so it produces faster for us. But when we look at our edges, like along this crown molding up at the top here, we will see a little bit of jagged appearance to it. So I hit Apply and OK, and I'm going to hit Start Rendering. So the first thing that it does when it's looking at producing the rendering for us is it's looking at the lighting. So it's going through, and right now you can see it's creating that background mask. It knows it has to rip out the background, and now it's doing the global illumination. So it's looking at all the lights that are in the space, turning them on, showing how they're going to illuminate in the space and where I'm going to be getting my lighting from. And it's going to be grabbing that from both the exterior, the sunlight that's coming in through our windows, and from the actual lights on the ceiling as well, and how they're going to have the light come from them as well. And as it goes through and produces that image, it's going to tell you just how long it's going to take to create that image itself. So right now it's doing its second pass. It did its first pass. Now it's on its second pass of all the different lights in the space. And then once it's done the illumination, then it goes through and it does the ray tracing on the image itself. When it does the ray tracing, what it's doing is it's combining those two different types of light, our exterior and our interior, and all the different lights that are in the space, and it's giving them a lighter, more natural effect. So as it's producing this, and I don't know if you can see the images that are kind of slowly kind of snapshotting on my screen, we're already able to see some reflections in the floor, some reflections on the countertop, the lighting coming in. And what you'll notice, if you can see that flashing of the image, that the background's disappeared. It's actually lifted it out like we wanted it to. And it's creating the rendering, and then once it's done the rendering, we'll be able to put it back in again. And to put it back in again, I'll just circle that over here. We'll be able to apply this static background to it. Once it's done, we're going to click that on, and that'll bring the background back into it. We also have these options right here, brightness and burn. So as you're producing the rendering, and if you've turned off all the lights and you're finding that it needs more flash, just think of using a flash on a camera. If it needs to be a little bit brighter, you can pump up this brightness, and you can even do that as it's working with the rendering and it's producing it. So right now I can be hitting this up arrow and getting it brighter and brighter as it goes. And with the burn as well, I can be reducing the burn effect that it's having. If any lights are creating that burning kind of circular pattern on any of my materials, I can try to get rid of that as well. So you can be watching the image as it creates and having an effect on it by changing these values as it goes through. Once it's done, we'll apply that static background, and then we have different options on how we want to save this image right here. When we save it, we can save it as a JPEG, or we can save it as a bitmap. And I often get questions about which is better. The JPEG is great for online material. So if you're going to email it to someone or you're going to post it to your website, the pixels involved in creating a JPEG image are not as close together. They're looser, so it's a smaller file size. So on your website, it can load it much quicker. Whereas in a bitmap, the pixels to create that image are tighter together, and there's more of them. So it's a larger file size, but for magazine ads or something that you're going to actually print out and hand to a client, it's a much better looking image. It just takes longer to upload onto a website. So JPEGs for digital and bitmaps for print materials. Underneath all of that as well, you'll also see this option here to convert it to a grayscale. That allows you to create it as a black and white image. So if you've created the photorealistic rendering, but you don't want your clients to get hung up on the material choices yet, you want it to give it the reflection in the image and the photorealism, but then you can save it as a black and white photo so they can see the image but not be hung up on any of the material choices that you've made, especially if they haven't picked them themselves. So here is our medium level rendering. And in the medium level rendering, you can see on the left-hand side here, looking at the countertop and the backsplash, where we've got about 15% specular. See how it's reflecting the outside image? The lighting is coming through here and reflecting off of it. The light from the window over here is reflected into our glossy floor finish. Look on top of our breakfast bar area. You can see the lights illuminating down there. And because the light source has been dropped, it's not up too high, it's not burning into our ceiling either. And that's the same over here on the pot light over our sink. The light has been dropped probably about 6 inches. So we're getting a nice lighting effect on our countertop, but it's not burning our ceiling as much. So this is a medium level rendering. The higher we go, the better that's going to look. And I draw your attention over here. I left that noise reduction only about 15, so you can see a little bit of noise happening in there as the light's coming through and working with the other lighting. So if we had pumped that up to about 25, we'd probably see that reduced to almost nothing there. So now I'm going to tell it, and again, maybe I'll just play with these values here with brightness so you can see it happening. So as I hit that brightness, I can brighten up that image as well, or I can reduce it and give it a darker appearance too. So you can play with that brightness, and then I'm going to tell it, and as soon as I tell it to apply that static background, I can no longer play with the brightness and the burn. It applies that background, and I can no longer change and affect it at all. Now, look at my green grass in this image. This is one where the texture intensity should probably be turned down. So in this model, I probably still have it at about 0.35, and I bring it down to about 0.25 here, so it's not so bright green sitting out there. So that's a texture intensity on the grass that would make that look a little bit better. We covered a lot of material today about rendering. We covered the settings that we used in our 3D Real View dialog box, we talked about the materials and all the settings that are behind them, and we talked about lighting. Those three things working hand in hand will help you to create really nice imagery. So if you're finding that your images are looking a little bit too bright, you know how to tone down the lights now. If they're looking way too glossy, again, pick one material, make it your glossy finish. Or if you're finding you're having a lot of speculation here on the side, turn down or turn up that noise reduction and keep bringing that up higher and higher. The higher you get it, it's going to take it longer again to produce it. So when you have a level 5, high noise reduction, high anti-aliasing, you know it's going to take a little bit longer to produce. But that medium level one that we produced today, because I gutted the image and made it smaller, was about 4 minutes and 22 seconds. If I wasn't online and producing this, I probably could have shaved off that to being under 4 minutes in time. But because we're using GoToWebinar today and I've got everybody watching my screen, that does makes it a little bit longer process as well. What I'd like to do now is answer any questions that you might have about renderings and how to make your renderings even better. Part of the GoToMeeting console that's on the right-hand side of your screen is a questions portion. You can type in your questions and I'll be able to answer those live right now during our broadcast. And then if there aren't any questions that are being posted, I will follow up, remember, with a booklet that will cover all those settings for you so you can remember what anti-aliasing is. There'll be a definition in that booklet. So let's go look at our questions. There aren't any. That means everybody fully understood and they're going to go away and create wonderful looking renderings, or that means people are hesitant to ask questions. And never ever hesitate to ask a question during our webinars. I'm the only one that does read them. And I think every question is really a great question, because if you're asking it, I know everybody else in that webinar that's watching it today probably has that same question too. So if you have a question, don't hesitate. Type it up there. This is your hour to learn. And if there's something that you don't understand or want me to cover again, don't hesitate. Ask that question. I also want to remind everyone that you do have toll-free technical support. So if there ever is a question that comes up about a rendering, don't hesitate to call in, and you can contact our support staff. I also want to bring you up to our gallery and show you the images that are there, because this is the type of imagery that you should be able to be producing with your software following the hints that I gave you today. All of these renderings were produced in our software, and you can see the different imagery that we're able to create. High resolution backgrounds, simple backgrounds, turning off the lights, turning on the time of day, and turning on the exterior lights helps you to create different types of imagery such as this. Those settings that I gave you today will help you to create renderings like this as well. So there doesn't seem to be any questions popping up there, so that means I'm going to end off today's class, and I'll email you out the booklet, and I hope you have a great day. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.